She turned down the offer. Read the script, knew it was going to be a hit, and said no, because she wanted to find out what would happen if she doubled her price. That was Meryl Streep in 2006, negotiating her fee for The Devil Wears Prada. The studio said yes immediately. 20 years later, at 76, she walked into the same situation with the sequel, and did the exact same thing. By the time this script is finished, you'll understand why her real financial picture looks nothing like the number most people quote, and why that gap exists by design. The figure most people land on when they search Meryl Streep's net worth is somewhere around $100 million. That number is real. It's also incomplete. The reasons it's incomplete are specific, and they go back to a set of financial decisions she made across 5 decades that most people in her position never make. Some were about saying yes to the wrong size paychecks on purpose. Some were about real estate trades that barely got covered. And one of the biggest was a deal she just made in 2026 that is already changing how studio executives think about legacy talent. On mode, all the biggest identification streaks start with where that $100 million figure actually comes from. Celebrity net worth, the most widely cited source, pegs it there. Other trackers put the number between $130 million and $170 million, depending on which assets they include and how they value property that hasn't sold yet. The honest answer is nobody outside her financial team knows the exact number, and the range between the low estimate and the high one is larger than the entire net worth of most people who will ever read about her. The reason for that range matters, and it starts a long way from Hollywood. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me, because this next part is why the whole story matters. The suburb that produced Meryl Streep was not the obvious starting point for a financial empire. She was born Mary Louise Streep in 1949 in Summit, New Jersey. Her father ran a pharmaceutical company. Her mother was a commercial artist. On the surface, comfortable middle-class life. She was a cheerleader. She won homecoming queen. She took opera lessons for 4 years as a child. Nothing about that early picture suggested what was coming. At Vassar, she performed in Miss Julie in 1969, and something shifted. Her drama professor later said he didn't think anyone had ever actually taught Meryl Streep to act. She taught herself. What she was teaching herself, specifically, was the skill of inhabiting another person so completely that her own identity disappeared inside the role. That skill cost her at Yale. She worked as a waitress and typist to cover tuition while performing in over a dozen stage productions a year. At one point, the workload gave her ulcers. She nearly left to study law. She didn't leave. And in 1975, the year she graduated, she moved to New York. Robert De Niro saw her on stage in a production of Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard. He recommended her to the director of his next film. That recommendation led to an audition for The Deer Hunter. She got the role. The studio paid her $35,000. That's equivalent to roughly $140,000 today. For the work that launched one of the most financially durable careers in the history of the industry, Meryl Streep earned less than most entry-level corporate jobs pay now. What happened next is the reason this story spread across the internet. 1 year after earning $35,000 for The Deer Hunter, Streep was paid $85,000 for Kramer vs. Kramer. That film won her her first Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress in 1980. 2 years after that came Sophie's Choice. She played a Polish survivor of Auschwitz and learned Polish phonetically, convincingly enough that native speakers later described her accent as authentic. She filmed the central scene, the one in which her character is forced to choose which of her 2 children will survive, in a single take and refused to repeat it. The emotional cost was too high. That performance won her a second Oscar, this one for Best Actress, in 1983. By the mid-1980s, her per-film rate had reached $4 million. The trajectory from $35,000 to $4 million in under a decade is not a normal Hollywood arc. It reflected something studios were calculating carefully. There was no direct replacement for what she was doing. If you wanted the things she brought to a project, you paid what she charged. That leverage accumulated quietly through the 1980s and 1990s, but the moment that defined how she would use it, and how she would sometimes refuse to use it at all, came in 2006. Most people who know this story stop here, but the real story starts right now. When the producers of The Devil Wears Prada called Streep with an offer, her first move was to say no. Not because she didn't want the role, she told the Today Show in April 2026, 20 years later, while promoting the sequel, exactly what happened. She read the script. She knew it was going to work, and she told the studio she wouldn't do it unless they doubled the offer. They said yes immediately. That response told her something. When a studio agrees that fast, It means the first number they quoted you was already below what they were willing to pay. She pocketed $5 million for The Devil Wears Prada. The film was made for a reported $35 million. It grossed $326 million globally. Miranda Priestly became one of the most iconic characters in modern cinema, and Streep received her 15th Oscar nomination for the role. Then, in 2011, she did something that looked like the opposite. She accepted $1 million, dramatically below her market rate, to play Margaret Thatcher in The Iron Lady. That film won her a third Academy Award. And then she donated the entire $1 million salary to the National Women's History Museum. Not part of it, all of it. One phone call, one conversation. That's all it took to change the direction of everything. While the acting fees were getting the attention, Meryl Streep was building a separate financial structure in the property market that barely registered in coverage of her career. In 1985, she and her husband, sculptor Don Gummer, paid $1.8 million for a 90-acre estate in Salisbury, Connecticut. The property includes a 47-acre private lake. Real estate analysts who have assessed the holding estimate its current value between $5 million and $8 million, a return on a piece of land she has held for 4 decades while living on it. In 1995, she bought a New York City townhouse for $2.75 million. A decade later, she sold it for $1 million. That's a 6 car $9 million profit, or a 318% return on a single property. In 2006, the same year The Devil Wears Prada came out, she paid $10.03 for a Manhattan penthouse. In 2020, she sold it for $16 million. Across those transactions alone, the real estate side of the ledger accounts for roughly $20 million in verified gains. Add in the Connecticut estate's appreciation over 40 years, and the Pasadena property she purchased for $3.6 million in 2017. And the property portfolio starts to look like the quiet parallel career of someone who understood compound appreciation before most of her industry peers started thinking about it. Here's what the comments kept asking, and here's the answer they never got. Until now. 20 years after the original film, The Devil Wears Prada 2 went into production with a $100 million budget. Director David Frankel later confirmed that most of that budget went to the cast. Streep's fee for the sequel, confirmed by Variety in May 2026, was $12 million. That's more than double what she earned for the first film, for a character she created and owns in the cultural imagination. On top of that, she negotiated performance bonuses tied to box office milestones, bonuses that could push her total earnings on the film past $20 million if the theatrical run continues. The film opened on May 1, 2026, and crossed $440 million globally in under 2 weeks, already surpassing the original's entire theatrical run. But the detail that didn't get the coverage it deserved was this. Streep used her leverage to force the studio into a favored nations deal for her co-stars. Anne Hathaway and Emily Blunt each received identical $12 million contracts. In Hollywood, the talent whose star power generates the negotiating room almost never shares that room equally. Streep did. She told the Today Show of the sequel, "This one, honey, they spent the money." What Streep did with the favored nations clause was not a publicity move, it was a structural intervention, using maximum leverage at maximum value to set a new pay standard for a film that could not exist without all 3 of them. And that's when the decision was made, the one nobody around her saw coming. In 2026, the same year Prada 2 opened, Meryl Streep made a separate 7-figure donation to the National Women's History Museum, the same institution she donated her entire Iron Lady salary to in 2011. The museum has since established the Meryl Streep Educator Award in her name, honoring an exceptional educator annually who advances the teaching of women's history. This is the financial pattern that makes her wealth consistently hard to calculate from the outside. She takes reduced fees on prestige projects. She donates at scale. She holds property for decades instead of flipping it. And when she does command her full market rate, don't look up in 2021, which Variety confirmed was her highest single film payday ever, though the exact number was never reported. The check goes largely unreported. The gap between the $100 million number most people cite and the upper estimates closer to $160 million comes down to this. Her asset base is structured to produce value quietly, across multiple decades, in ways that don't generate press releases. Real estate held 40 years doesn't make headlines. Back-end profit participation on a $326 million global hit compounds differently than a flat fee. Charitable donations reduce taxable income and build institutional relationships simultaneously. The financial portrait that emerges is not a passive accumulation. It's a system built by someone who understood early that the only number that matters is the one that still exists after everything else is subtracted.